Let me tell you something that most people miss, not because it's hidden, because they're not looking. Nations, like people, move not by chance but by cause and effect. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan has deep roots that trace back to the early years of the Cold War. It began in the 1950s when the U.S., driven by the desire to contain Soviet influence in South Asia, sought regional allies that could serve its strategic interests. Pakistan, a relatively new nation at the time, was eager to gain international recognition and military support. This alignment of interests laid the foundation for a relationship built more on geopolitics than on shared values. Throughout the decades, U.S. support for Pakistan was largely dictated by shifting global and regional dynamics. During the Cold War, Pakistan joined alliances such as SEATO and CENTO, positioning itself as a key ally in America's anti-communist strategy. In return, the U.S. provided significant military and economic aid. India, on the other hand, followed a policy of non-alignment and maintained close ties with the Soviet Union, which naturally made Pakistan a more appealing partner for the U.S. from a strategic standpoint. This dynamic continued to evolve in the 1980s when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. once again found Pakistan to be an indispensable partner, this time as a conduit for arming and supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. Billions of dollars in aid and military supplies flowed into Pakistan, while its intelligence agency, the ISI, played a central role in the proxy war. However, this era also saw the rise of extremist elements, many of whom would later pose significant threats to global security. The consequences of this support would unfold in the years to come, particularly in the post-9/11 world. After the September 11 attacks, U.S. foreign policy underwent a dramatic shift. Pakistan was declared a major non-NATO ally, and once again, massive aid and military cooperation were initiated under the umbrella of the global war on terror. The U.S. needed Pakistan's assistance to operate in Afghanistan and to track down al-Qaeda operatives. While Pakistan did provide logistical support and captured key terrorist figures, there were growing concerns in Washington over its alleged duplicity. Evidence increasingly pointed to the idea that while Pakistan was fighting some extremists, it was simultaneously harboring others, particularly those focused on India and Afghanistan. Despite these concerns, aid continued to flow. This persistence and support was not without controversy, as many in the U.S. government and public questioned the rationale behind funding a country that appeared to be playing both sides. At the same time, India's global stature was rising. Its democratic values, growing economy, and increasing alignment with U.S. interests made it an obvious partner. Yet the legacy of Cold War policies and the inertia of past alliances meant that U.S.-Pakistan relations continued, even as they grew more complex and often contradictory. This historical backdrop is crucial for understanding the contemporary dynamics of U.S. support for Pakistan. The relationship was never built on ideological alignment or shared democratic values. Instead, it was shaped by expediency, strategic necessity, and geopolitical calculations. This makes the relationship inherently transactional and susceptible to fluctuation based on changing global interests. The United States has repeatedly overlooked Pakistan's internal policies, military control, and support for non-state actors because of larger strategic aims, whether it be countering the Soviets, gaining leverage in Afghanistan, or maintaining influence in South Asia. Furthermore, the historical support has created a dependency model in Pakistan's strategic thinking. Rather than pursuing long-term internal development or democratic strengthening, much of its foreign policy has revolved around maintaining U.S. support through geopolitical bargaining. This has not only hindered its own progress, but also affected the balance of power and security architecture in South Asia. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan has often been defined by strategic necessity rather than alignment of democratic values or shared political ideologies. While the United States has long projected itself as a global advocate for democracy, transparency, and human rights, its support for Pakistan illustrates the complex reality of international relations, where national interests frequently override ideological commitments. This dichotomy between strategic interests and democratic values is central to understanding the inconsistencies in U.S. foreign policy and the challenges it poses for regional partnerships, especially with democratic nations like India. From the outset, the United States saw Pakistan as a valuable partner in a volatile region. Its geographical location, bordering China, India, Iran, and Afghanistan, made it a strategic asset during critical phases of the Cold War and later during the War on Terror. These strategic calculations led Washington to provide extensive military and economic assistance to successive Pakistani regimes, many of which were military dictatorships. This support often came at the cost of promoting democratic norms, as the U.S. prioritized immediate geopolitical benefits over long-term political development in Pakistan. This pattern was evident during the rule of General Ayub Khan in the 1960s, when the U.S. provided significant aid and military support despite the undemocratic nature of his regime. The trend continued with General Zia al-Haq in the 1980s, whose regime received considerable U.S. backing during the Soviet-Afghan War. Zia's rule, marked by the Islamization of Pakistan's political and legal systems, was largely ignored by Washington as long as Pakistan remained committed to supporting the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. The same approach was observed during General Pervez Musharraf's era in the early 2000s, when Pakistan once again became a frontline state in the War on Terror. Despite serious questions about Musharraf's legitimacy, media censorship, and human rights abuses, the U.S. continued to endorse and support his leadership due to his willingness to cooperate with American counterterrorism efforts. These decisions reflect a recurring theme in U.S. foreign policy: a willingness to compromise on democratic principles when strategic interests are perceived to be at stake. This not only sends mixed signals to the global community, but also raises fundamental questions about the credibility of U.S. commitments to democracy. For democratic allies like India, this creates a paradox. While India shares values and institutions with the U.S., such as free elections, a vibrant civil society, and an independent judiciary, it is often seen Washington extend greater support to Pakistan despite the absence of these democratic features. This contradiction is further exacerbated by the fact that many of the groups supported or tolerated by elements within the Pakistani establishment have targeted both American and Indian interests. The presence of terrorist safe havens, the lack of action against groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, and the continued military dominance over civilian institutions in Pakistan are often criticized by Indian policymakers. Yet, Washington's repeated decisions to renew aid packages or enhance military cooperation with Islamabad are perceived in New Delhi as ignoring ground realities and undermining the principles of strategic alignment based on value. The strategic versus values dilemma also complicates U.S. diplomacy in the region. While advocating for a rules-based international order and calling for democratic unity in global forums, the U.S. simultaneously engages in realpolitik that undercuts these very messages. This leads to skepticism among allies and competitors alike, who interpret such behavior as inconsistent or opportunistic. For India, which has steadily moved closer to the U.S. through defense agreements, trade partnerships, and shared strategic goals, this ambiguity in American policy creates friction and mistrust. Another aspect of this dilemma is the long-term cost of supporting regimes that do not reflect democratic value. In Pakistan, repeated support for military leaders has weakened civilian institutions and fueled anti-American sentiment, as many citizens view U.S. involvement as complicit in domestic repression. This erodes U.S. soft power and diminishes its ability to positively influence reform or foster long-term stability. In contrast, sustained engagement with democratic countries like India allows for more predictable and stable partnerships grounded in mutual respect and accountability. The impact of U.S. support for Pakistan on counterterrorism and regional stability has been a deeply complex and controversial subject. On one hand, the United States has relied heavily on Pakistan for logistical and intelligence support in its broader counterterrorism efforts, particularly during the War on Terror following the September 11, 2001 attacks. On the other hand, this support has often been undermined by Pakistan's own domestic and regional policies, especially its relationship with certain non-state actors and militant groups that operate within and beyond its borders. This duality has created a situation where American aid and cooperation have not always translated into greater stability or the effective dismantling of terrorist networks. From the early 2000s onward, Pakistan was positioned as a critical ally in America's efforts to dismantle al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It provided access to key military routes into landlocked Afghanistan, intelligence sharing, and the capture of several high-profile terrorists. The U.S. rewarded Pakistan with billions in military and economic aid, as well as recognition as a major non-NATO ally. However, alongside this partnership, there emerged a persistent concern within American intelligence and policy circles about Pakistan's commitment and reliability. This concern was rooted in the fact that while the Pakistani military was assisting in U.S.-led operations, segments of its security establishment, particularly the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, were alleged to be providing sanctuary and support to groups that threaten regional security, especially those targeting India and Afghanistan. The discovery of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in 2011, a short distance from Pakistan's premier military academy, was a turning point that exposed the contradictions in the U.S.-Pakistan counterterrorism relationship. It raised serious questions about how the world's most wanted terrorist could live undetected in a military garrison town, and whether elements within the Pakistani establishment had been complicit in sheltering him. While the U.S. conducted a unilateral operation to eliminate bin Laden, the incident severely damaged trust between the two countries and further fueled Indian skepticism regarding Pakistan's counterterrorism credentials. Pakistan's selective approach to dealing with terrorist groups has long been a destabilizing factor in South Asia. It has cracked down on some outfits that pose an internal threat or draw international scrutiny, while tolerating or covertly supporting others that align with its strategic goals, particularly in Kashmir and Afghanistan. Groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, responsible for the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, involved in the 2019 Pulwama attack, have operated with relative impunity in Pakistan, in 9 locations in Vietnam, and have invaded peacefully after 100 years of activity. In Jen-Ghor-Zamin, despite being banned on paper, their infrastructure and leadership have often remained intact, with public rallies and fundraising continuing under different names. This duplicity undermines not only regional peace, but also the credibility of global counterterrorism efforts. The U.S. response to these developments has been inconsistent. While some aid programs have been suspended and strong statements issued, Washington has often stopped short of imposing significant consequences, citing the need to maintain engagement for broader strategic reasons, including nuclear non-proliferation and influence in Afghanistan. This tolerance has sent mixed signals to both Pakistan and its neighbors, particularly India, which has repeatedly expressed concern over U.S. leniency toward Islamabad. Despite its links to cross-border terrorism, for India this represents not just a strategic frustration, but a direct national security threat that complicates its own counterterrorism operations and diplomatic calculus. Moreover, the instability created by Pakistan's ambiguous stance on terrorism has implications far beyond India. In Afghanistan, the Taliban's resurgence has been attributed in part to support networks within Pakistan the breakdown of American efforts in Afghanistan and the chaotic withdrawal in 2021 have reignited debates about Pakistan's role in undermining a sustainable peace process. This further reflects how the U.S. reliance on Pakistan has often come at the expense of broader regional stability. Counterterrorism efforts that lack coherence and consistency not only weaken America's position in South Asia, but also embolden extremist networks that feed off instability and state ambivalence. India's rising global position has increasingly brought it into alignment with the United States, reshaping the strategic landscape of South Asia and altering the dynamics of the U.S.-Pakistan-India triangle. As the world's largest democracy, a rapidly growing economy, and a key player in the Indo-Pacific region, India has emerged as a natural partner for the United States in its pursuit of a stable, rules-based international order. This growing alignment is underpinned by shared democratic values, mutual economic interests, and a converging strategic vision, particularly in countering the rise of authoritarian powers and ensuring maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Over the past 2 decades, the U.S.-India relationship has transformed from mutual suspicion during the Cold War to a robust strategic partnership. Key milestones, such as the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement in 2008, growing defense cooperation through foundational agreements like CUMCASA and BICA, and expanding joint military exercises, have signaled a deepening trust between the two nations. India has also become a critical partner in multilateral forums such as the Quad, alongside the U.S., Japan, and Australia, reflecting a shared commitment to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. This strategic realignment has created a contrast with the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, which has remained mired in transactionalism and marred by mutual distrust. While the U.S. has often relied on Pakistan for specific operational objectives, such as logistics during the War on Terror, it has found a more stable and ideologically aligned partner in India. India's consistent democratic governance, economic liberalization, and growing technological and defense capabilities have enhanced its appeal as a long-term partner. Washington increasingly views New Delhi as a counterbalance to China's growing assertiveness in Asia, further reinforcing the strategic logic of closer India-U.S. cooperation. At the same time, India has actively sought to diversify its defense partnerships and reduce historical dependence on Russia. This shift has opened new avenues for cooperation with the United States in areas such as arms procurement, joint research and development, and technology transfers. Initiatives like the U.S.-India Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, DTTI, are examples of efforts to promote deeper collaboration. Furthermore, the growing presence of Indian tech talent in the U.S., robust people-to-people ties, and expanding trade volumes have added additional layers to the bilateral relationship. This closer alignment, however, brings challenges when juxtaposed with continued U.S. engagement with Pakistan. India remains wary of American military aid to Pakistan, particularly when such support indirectly strengthens elements that India perceives as hostile or destabilizing. The presence of terrorist networks operating from Pakistani soil, often with minimal pushback from its establishment, is a point of constant friction. From India's perspective, continued U.S. support to Pakistan, especially in the absence of accountability, undermines the very foundations of the India-U.S. strategic partnership. India's rising global profile also means that it expects to be treated not just as a regional power, but as a strategic equal. This expectation includes greater sensitivity from Washington regarding India's security concerns, especially vis-à-vis Pakistan and China. The Galwan Valley clashes with China and the recurring tensions with Pakistan over Kashmir are seen in India as part of a broader regional security matrix. As such, India assesses U.S. foreign policy choices not just through the lens of bilateral ties, but through their broader regional implications. The trajectory of India-U.S. relations will also be shaped by how consistently the U.S. aligns its strategic behavior with its stated values. India's leadership and foreign policy establishment closely observe how Washington navigates its legacy relationships, including with Pakistan. Decisions that appear to reward or overlook destabilizing actions can create dissonance and affect strategic trust. As India continues to rise, both economically and geopolitically, its influence over regional affairs and global governance will expand, making it an even more critical partner for the United States. Economic and defense cooperation form the backbone of the evolving India-U.S. relationship, and any perceived imbalance in how the United States engages with Pakistan has significant implications for this partnership. As India continues to position itself as a global economic powerhouse and a critical security partner in the Indo-Pacific, the depth and sustainability of its ties with Washington are closely linked to how the U.S. manages its support to countries that impact India's national security, particularly Pakistan. The duality in American policy, strengthening strategic and defense ties with India, while simultaneously continuing aid and military cooperation with Pakistan, poses a challenge to trust and long-term planning between the two democracies. India has made substantial investments in modernizing its military and diversifying its defense procurement away from traditional suppliers. The U.S. has emerged as a key defense partner, supplying platforms such as C-17 Globemaster aircraft, Apache and Chinook helicopters, and P-8I surveillance aircraft. These purchases not only reflect growing interoperability between the two nations' militaries, but also signify a broader alignment of strategic priorities. Joint exercises such as UW and Malabar, as well as logistical agreements like LAMOA, demonstrate a tangible commitment to cooperation in maritime and air security. At the same time, India is working closely with the U.S. to strengthen its indigenous defense manufacturing through initiatives like the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, ICET. This includes collaboration in fields such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, quantum computing, and these efforts are not merely transactional, they are part of a vision for a resilient, innovation-driven partnership built on shared goals and mutual respect. India sees this growing cooperation as essential not just for national defense, but for securing a stable, multipolar Asia. In contrast, continued U.S. military aid to Pakistan is often viewed in India as an outdated policy that fails to reflect the realities of modern geopolitics. Over the years, American funds have supported the procurement of F-16 fighter jets, military training programs, and counterinsurgency tools for Pakistan. However, India argues that these resources have, directly or indirectly, enabled Pakistan's military to support operations that destabilize the region, including cross-border terrorism. Washington's decision to approve upgrades for Pakistan's F-16 fleet in recent years, despite India's strong objections, has only deepened concerns about policy contradictions and the erosion of strategic trust. The economic dimension is equally significant. India and the United States are among each other's top trading partners, with two-way trade exceeding $190 billion, 0 cents annually. U.S. companies have invested heavily in India's technology, energy, and infrastructure sectors, while Indian firms continue to expand operations in the American market. These economic ties are further reinforced by the presence of a large and influential Indian diaspora that contributes to innovation, education, and policy advocacy in the United States. India sees this economic interdependence as a stabilizing force that should be nurtured through consistent and principled policy. When the U.S. extends economic or military support to Pakistan without demanding accountability for its domestic and regional conduct, it creates a perception in India that Washington is not fully committed to its own stated principles of responsible behavior and transparent governance. This perception can influence India's foreign policy calculus, including its willingness to share sensitive technologies, deepen defense integration, or participate in long-term strategic frameworks. It can also limit the depth of cooperation in multilateral platforms where India and the U.S. are expected to lead together. Furthermore, the asymmetry in U.S. engagement with India and Pakistan sends signals to other countries in the region. It may suggest that strategic behavior, rather than adherence to shared values or responsible governance, determines access to American support. This undermines India's efforts to promote a rules-based regional order and creates obstacles in building regional consensus around security and development. For India, a stable partnership with the U.S. must be built on a clear understanding that its national security interests will not be compromised by legacy alliances or tactical accommodations. The complex and often contradictory nature of U.S. foreign policy toward Pakistan calls for a fundamental rethinking of strategic frameworks, particularly as the geopolitical balance continues to shift in the 21st century. The world is no longer defined by the binary simplicity of the Cold War, where alliances were formed primarily to counter the influence of a single adversary. Today's landscape demands a more nuanced and value-driven foreign policy, especially in regions like South Asia, where historical conflicts, nuclear deterrence, and transnational terrorism converge. The enduring pattern of U.S. support for Pakistan, despite repeated instances of duplicity and destabilizing behavior, suggests the persistence of an outdated paradigm that fails to serve either American interests or the cause of regional peace. U.S. engagement with Pakistan has traditionally been guided by short-term objectives rather than a coherent long-term strategy. Whether it was using Pakistan as a frontline state against the Soviet Union in the 10th and 980s, or as a key logistics partner in the war on terror after 2001, the relationship has been reactive and crisis-driven. This approach has encouraged Pakistan's military establishment to operate from a position of leverage, knowing that its strategic geography and role in regional conflicts provide recurring bargaining chips. As a result, instead of incentivizing democratic reform and regional cooperation, U.S. aid and military assistance have often reinforced the power of Pakistan's military intelligence complex and weakened civilian governance. This legacy of transactionalism undermines America's credibility when it seeks to promote a rules-based international order. While the U.S. regularly champions democracy, transparency, and human rights in global forums, its relationship with Pakistan has frequently contradicted those ideals. This contradiction is not lost on regional actors like India, which operates within a democratic framework and seeks strategic autonomy in its foreign policy. For India, the continued support of regimes or establishments that shelter extremist groups, suppress democratic processes, and engage in destabilizing actions erodes trust and strategic alignment. The call for a paradigm shift is not about isolating Pakistan, but about recalibrating the terms of engagement. The United States must begin to apply a more consistent standard in its foreign policy, one that prioritizes accountability, long-term stability, and shared values over short-term expediency. This includes reevaluating military aid, ensuring transparency in the use of economic assistance, and demanding clear action against terror financing and militant safe havens. A strategic reassessment should also consider the broader impact of such support on regional relationships, particularly with partners like India that are pivotal to U.S. interests in Asia. India's emergence as a global actor with growing economic, technological, and military capabilities presents an opportunity for the United States to reshape its regional partnerships based on convergence rather than strategic initiatives such as the Quad, increased defense interoperability, and cooperation on critical technologies point to a future-oriented alliance that could redefine security and economic architecture in the Indo-Pacific. However, for such initiatives to gain lasting momentum, there must be a shift away from legacy relationships that are no longer aligned with present-day realities. This paradigm shift also requires recognizing the evolving aspirations and sensitivities of regional powers. India expects not only recognition of its strategic importance, but also a level of diplomatic consistency from its partners. The perception that U.S. policy is guided by double standards, where principles are selectively applied, can create friction even within otherwise robust bilateral relationships. Such perceptions can influence how India engages with the U.S. on global platforms, shares intelligence, or coordinates on issues like cybersecurity, maritime security, and regional diplomacy. Reimagining U.S. policy in South Asia means moving beyond the inertia of historical alliances and embracing a more integrated, value-based approach that treats partners like India not merely as regional allies, but as equal stakeholders in shaping global governance. It involves understanding that stability in South Asia cannot be achieved through tactical compromises, but through strategic clarity and consistent application of principles.